All right, be seated, members of the jury. The objection by Mr. Shellhorn was sustained, and the last testimony by the doctor will be stricken from the record, and you're not to consider it. And the specific testimony is where the doctor said, his previous testimony where he talked about Mr. Barisone's biggest fear, which was completely delusional in his opinion, was that the children would be taken and killed by Lauren Kanarek and Robert Goodwin. That much you can consider. But his follow-up line that it was linked to a specific post, there's no evidence in the record of that the defendant ever reviewed any such post according to the doctor's testimony. So that last part must be stricken. You are not to consider it in your deliberations. All right. Let's bring the doctor in. Go ahead, Mr. Belinkas, continue.
Thank you. Doctor, based on your clinical interviews, the psychological testing, and the information that you reviewed in the record, did you form an opinion with regards to Michael Barisone's state of mind at the time of the incident?
Yes, I did.
And is that opinion to a degree of psychological medical certainty?
Yes, it is.
What is your opinion with regards to Michael Barisone's state of mind at the time of this incident?
At the time of the shooting, he suffered from a mental disorder, a psychotic break, a delusional disorder, which degraded his thinking to such an extent that he did not know what he was doing was wrong.
Did he understand the nature and quality of his actions?
No.
Nothing further.
All right, cross-examination.
Thank you, Judge. Doctor, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You're not board certified, are you?
They don't have board certification, and for psychologists, it's for psychiatrists.
Have you ever had any problems with your license?
No.
Now, your CV indicates that you had weekly meetings with Dr. James Wallach
Yes.
in 2010.
Yes.
He's a lawyer and a clinical psychologist.
Yes.
What was the nature of your meetings with him?
I would go over cases, and I wanted him to serve as an attorney to question me hard in terms of what we were talking about, so I'd get more practice.
Why did you start meeting with him on a weekly basis in 2010?
I wanted to improve. I've done that over the years with different people. I contacted an expert on the MMPI, Dr. Caldwell, and I met with him weekly, and other individuals that did the same. So what I tried to do in terms of my career, I tried to find someone who is more knowledgeable or better than me, and so to speak, I like to play tennis with them to up my game.
Now, your CV indicates that you were a postdoctoral fellow in neuropsychology at Columbia University?
Yes,
And that's normally a 2-year full-time program?
it is.
And you did the fellowship you were a fellow for 9 months?
Yes, I left the program.
Have you ever published in any peer-reviewed scientific journals?
I don't know if it's peer-reviewed, but I wrote an article with Arnold Lazarus on multimodal therapy.
That was the article from 1990?
Yes.
What's multimodal therapy?
It's a form of cognitive behavior therapy. It was developed by Arnold Lazarus. He was an eminent psychologist at Rutgers University. And it tries to have interventions with multiple components to it, not just one component, but it looks at the broad panoply of possibilities of interventions for a person.
And that's that's related to therapy. It's not related to diagnostic.
No, it's therapy.
Now, you were the chief operating officer for the publishing company that put that book out?
One book. There was a book that was written by Dr. Fay, Prescription for Quality Relationship. And I developed a friendship with him, and through him, I met Dr. Lazarus.
Now, you're a member of the American Psychological Association.
Yes.
Are you a fellow?
No,
Do you know what the criteria is to be elected a fellow?
I don't know.
Would you be surprised if I told you it was based on contributions?
Objection, Judge, he says he doesn't know.
He's a member of the association, Judge.
He said he didn't, said he didn't know.
I'll move on. Have you ever held any offices with any professional associations?
No,
Have you ever received any awards from any professional associations?
no, I just received a reward from the prosecutor's office in Hudson County on a particular case that I did.
So with respect to your peers in these professional organizations, you've never received any awards?
No,
Now, you indicated that you've testified at trial in the past.
yes,
Have you testified for both the prosecution and the defense?
yes.
Can you estimate approximately how many times in the last 10 years you've done that?
I don't know offhand, but over the, since my career, at least 100 times.
For each side?
No, not for each side, let's say 50-50.
Have you ever been hired by the prosecutor or the defense and then given an opinion that's inconsistent with the party that's hiring you?
Oh, yeah,
Can you estimate approximately how many times
No.
you've done that in the last 10 years?
can't do that, but I did that with DIFUS, and I did that with the parental representation unit.
Now, I saw on your CV that you listed an update you attended at Harvard Medical School in October of 2018.
Yes,
How many days was that?
it must have been 4 days.
Why do you say must have been?
It usually runs from like Wednesday to Sunday. So it would be all day Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and half a day on Sunday.
Do you know how many hours that would be when you say days?
Gee, I don't know, 8 hours a day? I'm not sure.
How would that particular update be different from the continuing education seminars that you listed on page 3?
Well, the ones that are listed on page 3 for continuing education were just within forensic psychology. The other ones that are listed was on basically dementia, neuropsychology, and psychiatric issues. So that's how I differentiated it.
Have you ever given any seminars or presentations to your peers in the field of psychology?
Well, I gave 2 presentations to the fellows at Columbia on forensic psychology. So I had testified in the case, and the psychiatrist, who was Dr. Simring, he was the director. We were on opposite sides in that particular case. And after I wrote my report, he contacted me and asked me if I would present to the fellows. So I presented for 2 years.
And that was in 2008 and 2009?
Mm-hmm.
You've never presented at any of the national seminars or anything like that?
No, I had no interest.
Now, you indicated that you gave a battery of psychological tests to Michael Barisone.
Yes,
You would agree with me that you would never make a diagnosis based on a psychological test.
correct.
Now, you rendered a number of psychological diagnoses for Mr. Barisone.
Yes,
Would you agree with me that only delusional disorder would affect his ability to know and appreciate the nature and quality of his actions?
yes. However, for the attentional problem, that contributes to why he has the delusional disorder, it magnifies it.
But on its own, it wouldn't affect his ability
It
to know.
participates in the forming of, causing the impact of the delusions.
Doctor, would you agree with me that two people can have the same experience but perceive it differently?
Totally.
And would you agree with me that someone being mistaken about something is not a delusion?
No, it's not. It's not a delusion. A delusion is an experience that a person has that is put together in their mind incorrectly. And I gave the example of like a delusion. Like, for example, Michael Barison saw a Facebook post. And on the Facebook post, there was an orange color. The orange color generated in his mind the idea of flames, fire. From that, he generated in his mind the notion that his place was going to be burnt down. Okay? So I could look at it, and someone else could look at it and look at it differently, but the way he's thinking about it is disturbed.
Well, that wasn't my question. My question was, if someone has a mistake about a fact, or they're mistaken about a fact, does that mean that
No,
they're delusional
no.
about the fact?
If I said to you that Columbus came to the New World in 1592, I would be wrong. You know, and that's not a delusion. That's just a statement of fact.
Would you agree with me that a feeling is not the same as a delusion?
Correct. A delusion is a thought. It generates feelings.
Now, I'm going to ask you some questions about what you reviewed and what you didn't review in the case. But would you agree with me in general that if there was something that you didn't know or something that you didn't account for that you found out was different later on, that could change your opinion?
It would influence it. It depends on what it is.
I think you indicated that you had reviewed a great deal of the discovery in the case.
A lot.
Did you review any of the witnesses' recorded statements?
Yes, I did.
And you indicated that you reviewed the defendant's written statement that he prepared for Dr. Simring?
Yes.
And you said you said in your report that that was only 51 pages, that it should be 91 pages.
Yeah, it's 91 pages, what I saw. However, I thought within that, there were duplicate pages.
I can show you all of those pages if you'd like to go through them to check whether there are duplicates or are not duplicates.
I would not want to do that now, but I would love to meet with you because I clearly remember reading it, and I was remarked, this is so very repetitious.
Did you corroborate anything that you read there with any of the other discovery?
But you'd have to be more specific on that, I'm sorry.
If you saw something or read something there that was...
And look, I have to say this. I don't trust anything that a person says to me. So they could claim one thing or another, and I tried to see if there's an agreement. So he would tell me all kinds of things negative about, let's say, Lauren Kanarek. And when I looked it up, it was coherent with what he said. The event took place.
And you mentioned earlier that you spoke with Dr. Picone, but then you indicated you corrected yourself that that was a typo in your report.
Yes.
Are you aware that she's not a doctor?
I thought she was a doctor, a psychologist.
And your notes actually indicate, your handwritten notes indicate PhD next to her name?
Yes. That mean,
Where did you get that from?
I thought that's what she said, PhD.
So you believe when you spoke to Ms. Picone
I thought she was a psychologist.
that she told you she had a PhD?
Maybe she didn't tell me, but I thought she was a psychologist. I thought she was a doctor.
Now, Mr. Belinkis asked you some questions on direct examination about the discrepancies between your notes and your report and when you actually met with Michael Barisone versus when you didn't.
Yes.
And I wrote down on direct examination that you said,
Judge, I object to his reference as to what he wrote down.
I'm going to check and see if my notes are correct, Judge.
All right, well, he's refreshing his recollection, I suppose.
The
But you don't have to reference what you wrote down.
Well, Doctor,
Just ask the question.
did you meet with Michael Barisone on October 29th, November 5th, November 6th, November 19th, November 20th, December 4th, and December 5th.
No, I thought I said December 11th,
Well, that's why I'm asking the question. So-
4th and the 11th.
And you acknowledge that that's wrong in your report?
No, I acknowledge the fact that the dates I just gave you, or you just read to me, that's the correct time. That was the correct dates that I saw him.
But that's not what it indicates as far as the contacts in the bill that you gave, correct?
Correct.
Now, I'm going to ask you some questions about the various tests that you administered, Doctor. You talked about the Rorschach test,
Yes.
and you didn't actually administer the Rorschach test to...
Judge, I will object to this based on your ruling.
You talked about this, Judge. Doctor, you were asked questions on direct about the Rorschach test.
Yes.
You scored Michael Barisone on the Rorschach using Exner, correct?
Yes.
That's the Exner system.
Yes.
Just lost my notes if you give me a moment.
Sure.
Now, there are a number of different scoring systems for the Rorschach test, correct?
Yes.
And you used the Exner scoring system when you did the scoring.
Yes.
Are you aware of the Rorschach Research Council?
Yes.
You're aware that that was a council that was formed by John Exner himself in the mid-1990s?
Okay. Yes.
And are you aware that that council identified a number of significant problems with the Exner scoring system?
Yes.
For example, they noted that there's issues with reliability between different scorers.
That's with all the Rorschach systems.
They indicated that the Exner system was of questionable validity.
Questionable norms.
They also indicated that there was no research data that supported the Exner scoring system.
I doubt that.
Let me show you, if I can, S409 for identification. In a breakout room, please, Judge, if I could.
Sure. It'll appear on that computer screen, sir, once it's pulled up.
Doctor, can you
Oh.
see that screen?
Okay.
That's an article from Psychological Science, correct?
Okay.
And does that indicate or refresh your memory on the first page in that italic type on the left-hand side?
The article was written by James Wood, and I like his work. I have his book on the Rorschach. He's very critical of the use of the Rorschach completely. Now, the Rorschach is a very controversial test. There's two systems that exist right now, one by Exner system, and one by Meyer. there'd be very few people that would agree with you to throw the baby out with the bath. And while I tend to support James Wood's analysis of the Rorschach, I think you're going overboard by saying that the system is...
Recording in progress.
I think you're going overboard by trying to imply that the system is negated by people in the psychological community.
So you don't agree that the Exner system has a tendency to find illness that isn't present?
That's a common knowledge on the Rorschach system. It's a common knowledge, right? But that's not the full story. It's just not.
And doctor, I'm just asking
Okay.
you if you could answer my questions. So do you or do you not agree that the Exner system has a tendency to find an illness that isn't present?
That's one point of view on that. That's one point of view. That's not the full panoply of views on that.
Did you just, who was the individual that you just referenced, doctor?
James Wood.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as S410. Doctor, is that an article from the Journal of Personality Assessment?
Yes.
And that was, among the other authors listed there are Gregory Meyer.
Yeah, I know him.
In
I
fact,
know
you
of him.
cited Gregory Meyer in your report.
Yes. He has another system that's been developed.
And he's actually a member of the Rorschach Research Council.
Yes. May I say something to you?
And he actually developed this additional or different test, the RPAC.
Yeah. It's a Rorschach system that's different. A lot of these things you're touching on are very controversial. So if you get the book on the Rorschach system by Wood et al., you'll see that they imply, I'm not saying this is the case, but they imply that Meyer was bought out, basically, by Exner. He had written initially, like in a dissertation, a criticism of the Exner system. Exner then placed him on board with regards to his group he was working with, and he changed his opinion. That's the implication in that book on the Rorschach. It's with Gary Lilienfeld, Lilliefeld, Gary Lilienfeld, Wood, and others. So you're heading into a very controversial area.
The Exner system is controversial.
All the systems are controversial. I think I even referenced that within my report, saying that there's questionable validity on some of these systems. I still think you could use it. So I also referenced a book, which is a legitimate book, on assessment of psychosis.
Did you testify today about the potential issues or the validity issues with
not at
Exner?
all. Not at all, because that's not the sum and substance of my report. What I was doing is I was taking the information from the Exner that came out, or the Rorschach that was scored, and it fits in with other information. It's supported by other information.
Now, do you have to pay any fees to use that Exner
Yes.
computer program?
All the tests that I did, I had to pay for. So they're approximately $40 a test, maybe a little bit more.
Do you have to update that program periodically at all?
It depends on which company you're using, but like basically, you pay per test. And you have, like for the test from the Psych Corporation, you buy a access for $100. You buy an access for doing the test, and then you pay per test. So it's not for free.
Who runs the Exner system now, or the comprehensive system now that John Exner has?
He passed away. I don't know who's in charge of it. What happened was the family initially said that they didn't want any additional research, but they changed their opinion on that.
Are you aware that it's run by his daughter?
It could be.
Did you know that she's not a psychologist or a psychiatrist?
To me, I'm be honest, I think you're heading down a bad road because
Well,
it's not as.
Doctor,
Okay.
Doctor, we're not here to argue.
I
You-
apologize.
you
I'm not
answer-
trying to be.
Answer my
Yes,
question.
I'm not trying to be
Mr. Shell,
controversial.
Doctor, both of you be quiet. Your role here is not to opine on any road the prosecutor may be going down. That's his decision. Your job is to answer the questions. That's it, to the best of your ability. Now, we got that out of the way. Ask another question, Mr. Shellhorn.
Doctor, I'm going to ask you about the scores that you produced for the Rorschach test in this case. Do you remember the interpretive report that you got after rescoring the Rorschach?
I don't have it in front of me, but I remember like key elements of it.
Specifically, did you list what you considered to be the salient findings in your report?
Yes.
What's salient mean?
Key findings.
On page 7, well, I'll show it to you, Doctor. S435 for identification. Do you have that, Doctor?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that that's the interpretive report for the scores you gave Michael Barison on the Rorschach?
I guess, yes, yes.
If I direct your attention down to page 7, specifically under number 2, which is about halfway down the page. Would you agree with me that it indicates there that the individual has a potential for impulsiveness?
Yes.
You didn't include that in your report, did you?
I don't know what I wrote on that. I thought that, I wrote that he was emotionally unstable.
And I can direct your attention, Doctor, I see you looking at your report to pages 8 and 9.
Okay.
So you'd agree with me that the Rorschach scoring that you did indicated and reflected a potential for impulsiveness, but you didn't include that in your report?
Yes.
Moving down on S435, which is the Rorschach on page 8. And I'm going to direct your attention to number 7. Does it indicate there this individual exerts considerably less control over feelings than most adults?
Yes.
Does it indicate does not necessarily signify that he is unable to exert self-control and keep his emotions in check,
Yes.
but that he chooses not to do so?
Okay.
You agree with me, that's from the results that you got from the
That's from
Rorschach.
the computer printout.
And you didn't include that in your report, did you?
No.
Drawing your attention down to page 12, Doctor. Specifically number 21. Does it indicate the individual is excessively committed to seeing the world accurately
Yes,
and realistically.
okay.
And you would agree with me, you didn't put that in your report?
No, I don't need to on that, because for the simple reason that if an individual has a delusional disorder, I did indicate from another reference that it's not going to be picked up by this test. I had a long quote. So here's the thing. If you want to pick pieces out of this report and say it doesn't fit in with everything I've written, the point is that I'm looking for things that overlap, that agree with each other. So that's a factor that I use in terms of generating a report. But there's no way that you could write a report and think that you could put every single piece together. You have to use some kind of clinical judgment.
Well, you'd agree with me that if there was a common thread here of any of the things we've talked about with these other reports, and other tests rather, and you didn't put it in your report, that means that you ignored it.
I didn't ignore it. I also just said to you previously that I gave a quote from a current book on the assessment of psychosis, and it said that you're not going to be able to pick up delusional disorder on the Rorschach. And if you're trying to imply that just because he has a clear view of reality, that doesn't necessarily follow.
You also didn't put any of these quotes in your report, or these passages in your report, and then distinguish them or differentiate them, did you?
I don't believe I quoted. I thought I summarized what I saw was in the reports.
Well, we just pointed out a number of things that you didn't put in your report, correct?
You'll find that with all the testing that's done.
And lastly, on page 12 of 13, number 24, you indicated earlier in your testimony on direct examination that the defendant was incapable of understanding the nature and quality of his actions.
Yes,
Does page 12 indicate the individual is capable of maintaining a connected flow of associations in which ideas follow each other in a comprehensible manner?
okay, but you also recall from, yeah, it says that, but you also recall from our report that said it was a very low number of responses that were produced. I also wrote in my report the least number of responses. You have to have 14 responses. If you have less than 14 responses, you don't have a valid profile. And the fewer the responses are, and it's discussed by Wood and his associates, you can push down the pathology. I mentioned that in my report. So you need to take that into account, that you could have a suppressed level of pathology in it, given the fact that the number of responses were very low.
And I think my question was just that that was a indication that you received from the tests and from the scores, but that you didn't include that in your report.
But I just said that you could read this, but if you also know how many responses are given in the score, and I have a section in my report on that you could have a spuriously low sign of pathology in the report, given you have very few responses.
All right, doctor, let's move on to the MMPI, the MMPI-2. Did you rescore this test?
I ran it through the computer.
Now, I think you testified on direct examination about the MMPI-2, correct?
Yes,
And you testified in particular with respect to Scale 6. Can you remember, or can you remind the jury what Scale 6
Scale
examines?
6 measures paranoia.
And it's fair to say that none of these scale titles, the names, shouldn't be interpreted literally.
No, you should look further into the test. You should look at the subcomponent scores, PA1, PA2, PA3. PA1 shows delusional thought content of a very serious nature.
And doctor, I'm just asking you about Scale 6.
Yes,
So Scale 6 is titled Paranoia.
yes.
but it doesn't literally mean that it's testing paranoia.
Well, it's just said literally that you have to look at other scales on there. And if you literally look at other experts in the field, they're going to say it measures delusional disorder, a score of 90.
So the high score of 90 on scale 6, you would say is indicative of someone with delusional disorder?
Yes. And not just simply on that. Also,
And Doctor,
all right,
hey,
okay.
just please don't get ahead of me. I appreciate it, thank you. Well, isn't it true that people with high scores on scale 6 rarely endorse the existence of delusions?
I don't believe that at all. I've never seen that.
Who is James Butcher?
Oh, I know James Butcher. He's one of the MMPI figures.
And I think you cited him in your report as well, correct?
I might have.
He's a reputable
Yes.
person with respect to the
Yes.
MMPI-2. Have you ever looked at his book, Using the MMPI-2 in Forensic Assessment?
No.
Judge, if I may approach.
Sure.
I don't have this marked as an exhibit.
All right, well, what's the next exhibit number, just so we have a reference?
I believe it's S 454.
All right. That's 454.
Counsel, was that turned over to us?
Do you have an objection, Mr. Belinkis? Come to sidebar. Go ahead, Mr. Shelby.
Dr. Hasson, I'm going to direct your attention here to page 54. You would agree with me that this block in the middle talks about scale 6 paranoia?
Let me read it. Here's the problem you have with this. You don't have your T-scores here.
And doctor, you'll have a chance.
Okay.
But you'd agree with me that this does say, with respect to scale 6 paranoia, the existence of delusions and paranoid thought process are rarely identified within this score.
I agree that it says that there, but I also agree the fact that it doesn't have the score of 90 in there. And that's a very different horse of another color.
But you indicated you're familiar with James Butcher.
Yes,
Now, people who score high on scale 6 are also generally described as being suspicious, overly sensitive, argumentative, prone to blame others.
yes,
People with high scores on scale 6 also often express their hostility overtly and rationalize it as a result of what others have done.
yes, yes,
And you indicated this defendant, Michael Barisone, scored high on scale 6, exceedingly high.
I indicated that a T-score of 90. I've never seen in my career an individual score that high on scale 6 with validity scales that are within normal limits. And the reference you're giving doesn't give very high score, doesn't give any scores. It just gives a general discussion.
But you agree with me that James Butcher and others wrote in that report that an individual who scores high on the scale for paranoia rarely endorses the existence of delusions.
It's incredibly misleading. You would agree with me that on the references that
I'll ask the questions respectfully.
Just answer the questions, please.
So you agree that you just read that in that book?
Yes, I read that.
Now, you indicated that some of the tests that you administered, the defendant showed difficulty with his concentration.
On some of the tests, yes.
On the MMPI-2, which is S434 for identification, and we're going to pull that up for you now, Doctor. Did Michael Barisone endorse a number of persecutory ideas?
Yes.
And you'd expect that of a criminal defendant who's on trial?
Not necessarily. I would expect that someone who has a delusional disorder to get a score of 90 on scale 6 and a score of 105 on scale PA1, and also to get a score of 88 on the Caldwell index.
Well, if he indicates in respect to question 99, someone has it in for me and says it's true,
Yes.
you would expect that for someone who's been charged with a crime?
No, I just think I just don't agree with you.
Now, with respect to the MCMI-4,
Yes.
I don't know if you specifically mentioned that on direct examination?
Well, I administered it. However, I tried to check out the cut scores by looking up Rogers, and I didn't use it, even though the test came out in the same direction as the other tests, because the validity scales were weak on that.
Why did you use the MCMI-4?
It's a legitimate test. I wanted to look at personality disorder in him. However, I wanted to look at the current cut scores, so I looked up Rogers, and he didn't have any information on that, and then I decided not to use it, given the fact that I wasn't sure if it was valid, the conclusions.
Doctor, you mentioned the PAI test on your direct examination. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And specifically with the PAI, I think you testified that you did validity testing with respect to that test.
There's validity testing on there.
Judge, this has been marked as S436.
What?
Doctor, directing your attention to page 2. At the very top of every page on this document, does it indicate warning validity scales indicate hypotheses may not be valid?
Certainly does.
And this test itself actually indicated that there was the possibility of deliberate distortion.
I also indicated in my report that I used Richard Rogers' cut scores for NIM and MAL. They're different from the scores on this test. The cut scores for Rogers, the NIM, negative impression management, has to be above 110, and the MAL, which is like an index score of a group of different scores, has to be above 5. The MAL that was calculated was 3, and the NIM that was calculated was 92. So as I just said, I went with Rogers with regards to this, and I looked for Rogers with regard to the MCMI, and I didn't see anything, so I didn't score the MCMI. But that's why there's a discrepancy.
So with respect to the PAI, it does indicate that there's the possibility of some deliberate distortion.
With respect to one of the key experts in the United States, I don't know anyone who's more renowned than Richard Rogers. He's written multiple articles and books on malingering and deception. The scores that are being shown here are not invalid.
Did you indicate that in your report?
Yes,
You indicated that the PAI, you wrote in your report that the PAI indicated quote, the possibility of malingering. You
No,
wrote that in your report?
I indicated in my report that I used the cut scores from Richard Rogers for NIM and MAL. I indicated that. I didn't use the scores that were shown here.
Well, specifically, and I'll direct your attention to page 10 of the PAI that you administered and you scored. Does it indicate in the first full paragraph on page 10, the critical items should be reviewed to evaluate the possibility of malingering?
Where is this now? On my report?
PAI, page 10. It's been marked for identification as S436, and it should be on the screen in front of you.
Okay. Yes. And what is your
So
question,
you
sir?
see there where this report,
Yeah.
based on the test that you administered and you scored, indicates the critical items should be reviewed to evaluate the possibility of malingering.
I also just indicated to you a few
Do you
times.
see that, yes
I-
or no?
I see that.
And in that same paragraph, does it say, regardless of the cause, in all capital letters, the test results potentially involve considerable distortion and are unlikely to be an accurate reflection of the respondent's objective clinical status?
It
The
says that.
following interpretation is provided only as an indication of the respondent's self-description. You agree with me that the PAI that you administered and scored gave you that indication?
I agree with what you just read there, but I also agree with myself that Richard Rogers, who's a higher authority than the computer printout, would argue that those scores were not, they were genuine. They were not an indication of feigning. And I
And
gave you the
indicated
scores.
that in your report.
It's in my report.
It says
That
that
I-
that the critical items should be reviewed for the possibility of malingering?
Now, what it says in my report is that I used Richard Rogers' cut scores for it. Well, here's what Rogers did.
Doctor?
Okay.
Please just answer
All
my
right.
questions.
I will.
Thank you. Now, the PAI also gave a number of diagnostic possibilities, didn't it?
Yes.
Did it indicate the diagnostic possibility of delusional disorder?
No.
Did it indicate that malingering should be ruled out?
It could be, given the fact that using the incorrect cut scores on here.
Well, let me draw your attention, and this is a score, this is a test you chose, correct?
You
You
can,
chose to administer
Yes.
the PAI to the
Yes.
defendant.
let me make a comment to you.
Doctor, could you
I
please just
cho-
answer my
I
question?
use this test, right, but I have to use my judgment too. I have more knowledge that I try to use in terms of understanding it. So I looked at the cut scores by Richard Rogers. He takes Richard Rogers is trying to reduce false positives. So he and his group took this test. They wanted to reduce false positives. False positive would be, say, someone is malingering when they're not. And actually, malingering is not a diagnosis, as you probably know.
You chose to administer the PAI to Michael Barisone, correct?
Yes,
You took the results and you put them into this particular program to score it, correct?
yes,
The program gave you a number of various information, clinical features, treatment considerations, possible diagnoses, correct?
yes.
And you didn't include all of those things in your report.
I would never include
Correct.
everything in the report. I would use my judgment on the report. The test gave two things. It gave validity scales and also gave clinical scales. The validity scales said that the test was accurate.
And where the results of the PAI that you have in front of you as S46 didn't match your ultimate diagnosis, you didn't put anything in your report about why you ignored that or why you distinguished it.
I indicated that I'm not putting down malingering, given the fact that there's no evidence of feigning on this test. Because I used more accurate cut scores.
So where it says there's the possibility of malingering, you're saying that feigning is not indicated at all by this test?
Correct.
Doctor, you also mentioned that you administered the 16 PF test.
Yes.
And I know you mentioned several of the factors. I don't think you mentioned factor L. What does factor L measure?
Vigilance, high suspiciousness.
Did Michael Barisone have an extremely high score on this scale?
Yes,
His scale, or his score rather, for this scale was at the top of the range.
yes,
And a score like that would suggest problems with the projection of anger.
correct,
It would suggest a preoccupation with power dynamics.
correct.
And you'd agree with me that's not indicated in your report.
Well, I interpret it differently than you. I didn't interpret it as power dynamics. I interpreted it as hypersuspiciousness.
Doctor, I'm going to show you what's been marked as S443 for identification. This is the 16 PF results from the test that you administered. And you just indicated that you wouldn't say that factor L deals with the preoccupation of power dynamics, but you'd agree with me that that's exactly what it says in the test results.
It says it there.
Now, you mentioned, doctor, that you gave the SIRS 2, correct?
Yes.
Why did you pick the SIRS 2 as opposed to the SIRS 1?
Well, the SIRS-2 is a better test in that it was developed to reduce false positives. So in other words, accusing someone of either malingering or feigning when they're not. It was an upgrade.
Well, isn't it true that in the scientific community that there are concerns about whether the SIRS 2 accurately assesses feigning?
I'm going to respond to you. That's a complete misstatement. Now, there were 3 studies that came out. They criticized the use of SIRS-2. Basically, the problem with those 3 studies, the design was poor. And what they used was a test called the Miller forensic test. The Miller forensic test is high on sensitivity. Remember I gave the example of going through a magnetometer? It goes off. The SIRS-2 is high on specificity. They used the wrong tests and the wrong design to criticize the SIRS-2. There was 3 of those studies. That was answered by Rogers when he went over the designs of those studies.
So if authors published an article in a peer-reviewed scientific journal where they indicated that they had concerns about whether the SIRS 2 accurately measures whether someone's feigning or not, you would disagree with those authors and disagree with that scientific study?
I would agree with Rogers when he analyzed those studies and found that they were flawed. Those studies were seriously flawed. What they did was they used a screening test for malingering or feigning, a screening test, and they compared it to his test. His test is not a screening test. His test is designed to have heightened specificity, not to have false positives. The other test on the other side, the Miller, was set up for high sensitivity, to go off every time a person walked through that magnetometer. This test only goes off if someone walks through the magnetometer like with a gun in their pocket.
Doctor, let me ask you some questions about the TOM. Is that an acronym for the test of memory malingering?
Yes,
And you indicated that you gave that test to Michael Barisone.
yes, one of 4 tests.
And you indicated that when you gave Michael Barisone the test of memory malingering, that he had a poor score.
He had a score of 41 on trial 2 and trial 4.
And I think you indicated that to the jury on direct examination, that that score is poor.
It's on, yes, a score under 45 is considered a problem, with the exception if someone has some kind of like brain injury, a TBI or something of that sort.
And you didn't note any issues like that with Mr. Barisone.
Well, I did write, after I considered that he has some problem with visual memory, and he has some problem with attention. And I also mentioned that an odd finding was that on the VIP, which is a very superior test, on the nonverbal part, there was an indication of a problem sustaining attention. So I hypothesized that there's a possibility that the 41 score was due to the fact of his difficulty in different areas.
Now, you just testified that a score under 45 is a problem.
Yes,
I think that was your exact words. And you indicated that Michael Barisone scored a 41 on the test of memory malingering, correct?
yes.
That was on 2 of the trials, correct?
Trial 2 and the recognition trial.
His score on trial 1 was a 35.
Yes,
You didn't include that in your report.
you don't, that's not how you analyze it.
I didn't ask that question, doctor.
You would never include that.
Well, a score of 41 is actually indicative of someone who is likely malingering, correct?
Possibly so, if they don't have any other difficulty that's maybe impacting the score.
Judge, I'm going to ask to show the witness. I have it on my computer, but because it was highlighted, I think it's difficult to read. So this has been marked as S422.
All right.
Doctor, I apologize that this is difficult to read here. But would you agree with me that it says any score lower than 45 on trial 2 or on the retention trial should raise concerns that the individual is not putting forth maximum effort and is likely malingering?
Keep on reading.
Rather,
I can't read that.
I'm sorry, doctor. Rather than using the score of 45 as a rigid cutoff, it should be viewed as a guideline,
Yes,
with the likelihood of malingering increasing as the score deviates further from the normative baseline for each specific diagnostic group.
okay.
You didn't indicate that in your report, did you?
No, what I indicated was he's got a score of 41 and 41, and I indicated possible reasons for the low score, and it's inconsistent with the high scores on the VIP.
And you excluded the 35.
I would never report the first score. It's not part of the analysis. You give the first test, and you give the second, and you give the retention.
Judge, I don't anticipate that I'm going to finish in the next 15 or 20 minutes. I can certainly keep going.
Want to keep going a little while longer since we don't have tomorrow morning. So you can keep going, just for 10 minutes.
You had been asked questions about amnesia on direct examination,
Yes,
and you indicated that you diagnosed the defendant with dissociative amnesia.
yes, localized.
And I think you testified on direct examination that it could be dissociative amnesia.
Yes, I
So-
chose to diagnose that.
when you were asked whether you were sure of that or made that opinion within a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, is that the same as it could have been?
Yes. More likely than not.
Now, you agree with me that there's no memory disorder that's selective just for criminal behavior?
I don't know what that means.
Was there anything in the DSM that would indicate someone could have a memory disorder that's selective just for the time that they're doing something that's criminal?
It's possible. I wouldn't rule out any of that, and I wouldn't use the word malingering. Because if you're going to use the word malingering, you have to show a test that is positive for feigning. There's no test that I gave that show any feigning.
So my question was,
Yes?
is there any diagnosis in the DSM that deals with someone's memory being selective just for the time when they commit a crime?
No.
Now, you'd agree with me that the DSM also indicates that feigned amnesia is found more commonly in individuals with legal problems.
Well, I think the reference is not, they say, they don't use feigned, they use malingering amnesia, right? As a V code. The V code in that book, I think on page 715 or so, it basically states that in criminal situations you should suspect that there's malingering, but it doesn't prove that there's malingering in this case, because it's not just a simple criminal act, it's the fact that he can't remember something that was incredibly stressful.
And my question was, isn't it true that feigned amnesia is more commonly found in individuals with legal problems?
I don't know that. I don't know any data on that.
Is it true that feigned amnesia is more commonly found in individuals who wish to escape stressful situations?
Dissociative amnesia often comes with people who are in stressful situations, but they don't call it, you're using a term that doesn't exist. You're saying feigned amnesia. The term that's in there is dissociative amnesia. That's an emotional type of amnesia.
Judge, I'm going to refer to the DSM-5. Again, this hasn't been marked.
All right.
And I'll mark it when we're done with court, Judge. Doctor, you just said that feigned amnesia isn't a term that's in the DSM.
Not that I know of, with the diagnostic number.
I'm going to direct your attention to page 298. You would agree with me
Okay, go ahead.
that this page talks about dissociative amnesia.
Yes,
That's the diagnosis that you came up with for Michael Barison.
correct.
You would agree with me that there are a number of things listed after the criteria, diagnostic features,
Correct.
associated features, risk and prognostic factors.
Yes.
And if we get here to page 301, it says factitious disorder and malingering, correct?
Correct.
And you'd agree with me that the book says feigned amnesia is more common in individuals with legal problems, correct?
Okay, yes.
It also says feigned amnesia is more common in individuals with a wish to escape stressful circumstances.
Okay.
Does it then go on, many individuals who malinger confess spontaneously or when confronted?
Well, it's a strange article there because there's no specific diagnosis for feigned amnesia. It doesn't have a number. There's no number.
Doctor, if you recall my question, it
Yes.
wasn't whether or not there was a number or whether or not there was a specific diagnosis. I asked you if the diagnostic and statistical manual indicates that feigned amnesia is more commonly found in individuals with legal problems.
Possibly so, but
And
that
you told
criteria,
us that feigned
that-
amnesia does not
that-
appear in the DSM.
when you look at malingered amnesia, it's wrong. I could show you the data 80% of the time. Now, I'm not saying that, anyway,
And doctor, I'm just asking you about your diagnosis.
yes,
You diagnosed the defendant with The
Dissociative
possibility of
amnesia.
dissociative amnesia.
Dissociative amnesia localized.
And you would agree with me that in the comments or the follow-up statements about dissociative amnesia, it talks about feigned amnesia.
In that same paragraph, they used the word malingering and they used the word feigned. Those are two different concepts. I don't know if they made a mistake or what.
The authors of the American Psychiatric Association made a mistake
So-
when they published the
so-
DSM-5.
So look on page 715, I believe it's 715, for conditions V codes. And on that page, it discusses malingering. And those diagnoses, malingering, are wrong 80% of the time.
Now, you indicated, and we just read, rather, that it's true that individuals who malinger may confess spontaneously.
Okay?
You would agree with me at least that that's what we just read out of the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5.
Okay, yes.
You would agree that Michael Barisone was overheard at the scene saying, "I had a good life."
Okay,
You would agree that he was overheard in the ambulance saying, "Is this real? And I need to wake up."
yes,
You'd agree that in the ambulance he also said, "Someone drove down my driveway and said she was going to take my kids."
yes,
You'd agree that the defendant was overheard later at the hospital saying, "They destroyed my life in the last 6 months and they took it all away."
yes,
Did you ask him what he meant by any of those statements?
yes.
Did he tell you that he doesn't know?
He doesn't know what they meant. He doesn't even know how his arm was broken.
And you believe the timing and substance of those specific statements is vague?
They're not vague, but you have to have a context. He
Didn't,
was in-
didn't you
he
write
was
in your
beat-
report that they were vague?
Well, I asked him what they meant. I didn't know what they meant. I don't know what he's referring to, or those statements are referring to. It's not clear to me.
Do you recall in the written statement that he wrote for Dr. Simring, where he indicated on a certain page that after the DCP&P worker got there and he was in his office, that he only remembered 2 or 3 things that were blurry at best?
That's in his report, Dr. Simring's report, but I didn't ask that, what he remembered. I asked him the last thing he remembered.
The defendant saying he remembered 2 or 3 things and it's blurry at best is in Dr. Simring's report?
I believe it's in Dr. Simring's report, but or it's in the 51, the 91 pages. But I didn't ask him on that. I asked him the last thing he remembered.
So you didn't ask him what the 2 to 3 things were
No.
that he remembered after he was in his office, after the
What
DCP&P
what
worker
he
was-
said he remembered was lightning bolts coursing through his body, feeling confused, had trouble breathing. It was like he was having a panic attack, and he didn't know where he was, what he was doing, and the next thing he remembered was waking up at the hospital. And then I said, well, what was the first thing what you recall when you were waking up? And he said to me, I asked for a priest, and then I asked if my children were safe.
I had asked you the question earlier, Doctor, about,
Are you going to a different area?
Yes, Judge.
All right, we'll break now. It's about 20 of, we went 10 minutes over. I don't want to go any further. You get the morning off, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to resume at 1:30 or as close to 1:30 as we can. So please be here about around 1 o'clock or so, 1:15 at the latest. All right, thank you all. Please don't discuss the case.